I declare to you that a woman must not depend upon the protection of a man, but must be taught to protect herself, and there I take my stand.
The life of Susan B. Anthony is that which would impact those of later generations. Her voice lifted up the women's rights movement, paving the way for younger generations to carry on and fight for equality long after her death. She had begun a revolution, one that took a lifetime of work to accomplish, though she wouldn't live to see its success. But let us go back to the beginning to discover why her contributions to history were so instrumental. Born February 15, 1820, to Lucy and Daniel Anthony in Massachusetts, Susan Brownell Anthony was the second of 7 siblings. She grew up in a Quaker family that was committed to social equality, and this upbringing greatly influenced her role as an activist in later years. In 1845, the Anthony family moved to the outskirts of Rochester, New York, where they mingled with fellow Quakers who shared their advocacy for social reform. As a result, prominent reformers such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison were often guests at their home. Young Susan was often present at these meetings, and she began to form her views based upon the influence of her family. Although her family attended the first women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls and Rochester, New York in 1848, Anthony did not take up the cause until 3 years later. Prior to that time, she had devoted most of her time to the temperance movement. However, when male members of the movement refused to let her speak at rallies simply because she was a woman, she realized that women needed to win the right to speak in public and vote before they could accomplish anything else. Her lifelong friendship and partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had proposed a resolution giving women the right to vote, also began in 1851. The two instantly became close friends and worked together on reform movements, primarily women's rights. It wasn't uncommon for Anthony to go door-to-door campaigning for women's rights and the abolition of slavery. Passage of the New York State Married Women's Property and Guardianship Law in 1860, which gave married women in New York greater property rights, was Susan B. Anthony's first major legislative victory. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Anthony focused her attention on ending slavery. She organized the Women's National Loyal League, which gathered petitions to force passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in order to end slavery. Prominently known is a speech called "Make the Slave's Case Our Own."
Let us, my friends, for the passing hour, make the slave's case our own. As much as in us lies, let us feel that it is ourselves and our kith and our kin who are despoiled of our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that it is our own backs that are bared to the slave driver's lash, that it is our own flesh that is lacerated and torn, that it is our own lifeblood that is poured out.
However, the exclusion of women's rights in the abolitionist movement caused Anthony to shift her focus. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 15 supporters from the Rochester became the first women ever to vote in a presidential election. They were promptly arrested, and Susan B. Anthony used this as a way to bring her argument to the Supreme Court, where she is known for releasing her infamous speech, "Is it a crime to vote?" This speech argued in favor of a woman's vote as exercising the right as any other citizen of the United States.
Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but, instead, simply exercised my citizens' rights, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution, beyond the power of any state to deny.
Sadly, Anthony lost her case in 1873, barred from taking it to the Supreme Court. This didn't deter her, though, as she continued for the rest of her life working tirelessly to gain rights for women. One of her largest contributions came after she noticed that most historical literature failed to mention any women. Thus, in 1877, she, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and her supporters sat down to begin writing a work titled The History of Women's Suffrage in 6 volumes, a contribution that finally showed the value of women's role in history. In her later years, Susan B. Anthony worked with her biographer, Ida Husted Harper, on 2 of the 3 volumes of The Life and Work of Susan B. Anthony. The material was drawn mainly from scrapbooks she had kept throughout most of her life, which are now in the Library of Congress, and from her diaries and letters. Susan B. Anthony attended her last suffrage convention just 1 month prior to her death, closing her last public speech with the words, "Failure is impossible." She died in her Rochester home on March 13, 1906. By that time, only 4 states had granted women the right to vote. 14 years after her death, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was added to the U.S. Constitution. It is unlikely that this amendment would have been passed had it not been for the tremendous work of Susan B. Anthony.